So my name is Richard Moeran. I live in County Cavan in Ireland, and we're here in Ross Castle, which is County Meath. Meath and Cavan border on each other, and we're in Ross Castle, which was built approximately 500 years ago. Ross Castle would have been built as a defensive, strategic military building placed on the landscape, very much as a statement of Anglo-Norman rule in its day. And allegedly it was built with an £11 grant from King Henry VIII. In today's terms, that probably represents pretty good money if you think about what you can do with £11. The castle, like most Anglo-Norman castles, would have been built A, as a military garrison, B, as a statement of rule of law. This was the edge of the pale. You had rule in Dublin, and as you got further away from the capital, you tended to find that the rule of law probably had less effect. So building a castle on the edge of the pale, as this was known as the edge of the pale, because beyond the pale, the Anglo-Norman rule didn't exist. And you had the O'Reilly family, the far side of the lake, and they refused to be subjugated by the Anglo-Normans. And you had this kind of interface, and this would have been the interface between the Anglo-Normans and the O'Reillys. So building the castle here made perfect military sense, and also we're on good high ground. There would have been probably a garrison of maybe 15, 20 men in this castle, the area. They may not necessarily have stayed in the castle. So the castle was built by Richard Nugent, who was the 11th Baron of Delvin. And if you think in 1520, the 11th Baron of Delvin was already the 11th Baron. That will kind of give you some context that 500 years ago he was the 11th Baron. So this family of the Nugents had been well established in the area, in the neighbourhood, and were landowners, would have been politically well connected, and would have been fairly well heeled in all terms. So when he built this castle, he built it with the grant, and it would have been very much a legacy to his property. Would have established himself in a more powerful role. He died shortly after building the castle, and we know that his grandson inherited the castle, who was also Richard Nugent. Richard Nugent married quite young. He married reputedly a Lady Nangle from Navan. Lady Nangle came into the marriage with 8 sons from a previous marriage. So you can imagine picking up 8 stepsons from your first marriage. That was a brave move. Anyway, he married. She bore him, his wife, Lady Nangle, bore him his first child, her first daughter, and that child was called Sabina. Sabina Nugent would have spent probably summers here. The main castle that the Nugents lived in was Clonlinn Castle, which is back in Meath, closer to Dublin. But it was probably 2 hours on horseback to get from this castle to Clonlinn. So there wasn't that much of a separation between the two. So we'll set the stage somewhat if you can kind of place your mind back into this era 500 years ago. King Henry VIII was on the throne. Ireland was very much under the rule of the Anglo-Norman families, and there was many families that were vying for power, but there was no one particular individual who you could say was ruling Ireland at that stage, and this created all kinds of political complications. So you had the 13th Baron of Delvin, you had his daughter Sabina, and Sabina apparently fell in love with the chieftain O'Reilly's son, Orwin O'Reilly, which would have been an utterly forbidden love affair because you had two families that were diametrically opposed in politics and in every context. They were totally different. In fact, there was the Kilkenny Act, which prevented Anglo-Norman families from marrying into the Irish families. So it was political dynamite for Sabina to be fraternizing with Orwin O'Reilly. Anyway, the love affair blossomed, and like so many tragic romances, this one was to end in tragic circumstances, unfortunately. So we think, we're not entirely sure, but the legend or the story goes that Sabina's mum was going to try and get Orwin and Sabina out of the country, and they were going to cross the lake to be picked up by a carriage the far side of the lake, probably in Finney. The boat that they were travelling in overturned in a small squall or a storm. Orwin was killed in that accident. Sabina was badly hurt. She was brought back to the castle and died very shortly after that. Some say as a result of a broken heart. Who knows? But that is a very powerful story, and I suppose when you drive out of the castle and you're heading back to the main road, there's a little field on the right hand side, and if you look into that field there's a small clump of trees, and Orwin and Sabina are apparently buried in that field, and I'm told they're buried upright. Now whether that was because they were never married and it was more sensitive to bury them standing upright rather than lying down, I don't know, but again, that's what we've been told. But it's rather fitting that the two families must have come together for that burial, and they shared their grief, and I suppose in a sense it may have helped bring the two families slightly closer, because this was a time where there was a lot of conflict, and if you could avoid conflict, obviously that was better. The Baron became known shortly after that apparently as the Black Baron, Baron Nugent, and he got that name originally, according to some stories, he bought a cape in London, and it was a black cape, and somebody must have said, oh, there goes the Black Baron. Then there was another story that depicts the Baron in a slightly more sinister role, where he presided over the judgment of a young boy who allegedly stole a loaf of bread, and as punishment for that, the Baron apparently had him hung, which is a catastrophic thing to do for such a petty crime. But allegedly he presided over that. So anyway, you set the stage where he became known as the Black Baron. Not a whole hell of a lot happened in the castle that we know of for quite some time after the Black Baron had the tragedy of losing his daughter, and then the hanging of this boy in the neighbourhood. Probably they got on with their politics and their business. So if you fast forward from, we'll say 1530, 1540, 1550, 100 years later, we're into 1639, 1640. So we've got Cromwell arrives on the scene. And he didn't just arrive. Cromwell came to Ireland with a sort of a wrath of vengeance to properly sort out the Irish problem, so to speak, in his mind, and he went about it in a pretty gruesome way. And there is no love lost for Oliver Cromwell today in Ireland. So Cromwell sent, under the command of General Monro, a considerable force up to the northwest. They came up this way, and everybody would have known that that army was headed this direction, and allegedly one of the O'Reillys met with many other men in the castle the night before that force landed at Finney, and one of them was a man by the name of Miles the Slasher O'Reilly. And again, there's, like with all these stories, there's many different reasons why we're told he was a slasher. One of them was he was a slasher because he could use a sword, and he slashed with a sword, so maybe that was Miles the Slasher O'Reilly. The other one was because he had a cut on his cheek, and but anyway, we're not 100% sure. But we do know he was known as Miles the Slasher O'Reilly. They met in the castle. They created a strategy where they decided they were going to stand up against Cromwell's army, which was a big decision, because if you stood to Cromwell's army, if you stood against him, you were very much putting yourself into an absolute line of fire. Because when you decided to make that military decision against Cromwell, Cromwell ruled by saying, if you stand up against me, I will absolutely and utterly destroy you. And he was a terrifying force, and it wouldn't be just destroying you, it would be your lands, your family, your family's family, and they exacted tremendous revenge. So to make that decision to stand at the Bridge of Finney was a very brave decision. We know that when Cromwell's army went to cross the bridge in Finney, they never got across the bridge, because Miles the Slasher and that force of Irishmen that stood on the bridge, they held the bridge and they prevented Cromwell's army from crossing. And the story goes, and it's carved in stone in the village of Fenay, so it has to be true. The story goes that Miles the Slasher got into a serious fight with a Scotsman, and Miles eventually cleaved the Scotsman with his sword down through the middle of his head and killed the Scotsman, but he was mortally wounded himself, and he fell and he died shortly afterward. But the crux of the story is that Monroe turned his army around and left, and that night allegedly they set up camp not far from the castle, and out of vengeance or out of boredom or out of frustration, Monroe said to his artillery, "Train your cannons on that castle over there and you can practice," which they duly did, and as much light as they had for the rest of the day, they blew out the corner of the castle with afternoon or an evening sport, firing cannons. So the castle was now ruined. It was breached externally from the outside, and it was a ruin. Cromwell eventually did his job, and this area would have suffered quite significantly as a result of that. So the political landscape once again changed. The castle was now obsolete because there was no need for it. There was no money probably to rebuild it. Who would have rebuilt it anyway? The power of the Nugents had somewhat shifted at that stage, and the necessity for the castle really wasn't there because you didn't have this Anglo-Norman Irish interface anymore. So we know that the castle stayed in pretty poor shape for a long time after that. So we'll fast forward now, you come to 1840s, 1850s, and you've got the famine, and another O'Reilly played a key role in the castle's history, and her story is kind of very quickly placed on a plaque in the hallway, Mary Dease O'Reilly. And apparently she went out to America probably shortly before the famine or during the famine, like so many did, got to America, made a lot of money, and I've never discovered what she was able to do, whether she was a businesswoman or how she made money, but she came back to Ireland with enough money to be able to buy this castle to honour her ancestors. And we think back, it was a Nugent castle, but you had Miles the Slasher O'Reilly and you had Orwin O'Reilly, so there was a great O'Reilly history with the castle. And to honour her ancestor, she bought the castle, had it repaired, rebuilt the corner that Cromwell's cannons had blown out nearly 200 years before, put a roof on the castle. They put a lead roof on the castle, so a lot of money was spent on it. As far as I know, she didn't live here, re-established as a building, as a point of history. And we understand that a lot of people would have come from far and wide, travelled, come up the stairs, which you could have opened the front door because there's nobody living here, and you could walk out onto the lead roof and you could see for miles. So you could see probably Longford, Meath, Westmeath, Cavan, the whole of Lough Sheelin, and you're looking kind of nearly back out to the Dublin mountains, the far side. On a really clear day you'd probably see that far. So it was a fantastic place to come and paint or take photographs. And don't forget, we're in the early days of photography now, turn of the century. Again, the political landscape was changing enormously. There was a lot of fermentation in rural Ireland about land and who owned land and who wanted to own land. And of course, we know now, looking back, that they were on the cusp of tremendous change. But the castle represented a past that was probably not very relevant. We know that in about 1909, 1910, somebody went up onto the roof and they lit a bonfire on the lead roof, which burnt the lead. The lead melted, and then you had a hole through the lead, which meant that the rain came in and the castle was once again breached. Very shortly after that, you had World War I broke out, you had the Easter Rising. The whole landscape utterly changed. So just imagine coming through the famine in the mid-1800s, and then you move into this just upside down situation where everything changed almost within 2 or 3 years. So the castle represented at that stage, after the Easter Rising and the formation of a new Ireland, a new republic, this was very much a vestige of a past that had no place in the new Ireland. and probably would not have been well regarded. And other establishments, so those old Anglo-Norman buildings, were a bit of a blight on the landscape. So it was left to rot, which it did throughout the economic war of the 1930s, 1940s. Then you had World War II, 1950s. The country there was not a lot of money around here in the 1950s. 1960s, things were pretty bad. The castle was on its last legs, and I've seen some photographs of it taken in the 1960s, and it was in pretty poor shape. 1960s, 1970s, a man by the name of David Nugent came along, and David would have been a descendant of the original Richard Nugent, the 11th Baron and the 13th Baron, and David took a project upon himself to re-establish and rebuild the castle, and he spent the guts of 25 years, nearly 30 years, rebuilding, reshaping and building the castle and putting it back together as it stands today. So today it's a fine building. It's a B&B, or it's an accommodation, and we have guests from all over the world, and we're nearly 500 years old now, and it's a place of great history. It's historically important, and it's a lovely place to visit, because being on the shores of Lough Sheelin, no better place.